thank you everybody for joining us here today. It really is our pleasure, and thank you for that introduction. Oh. Okay, let's see if that's better. All right. So yeah, thanks everybody for joining us here. I know we're very excited to be here. How's that one for you? Yeah. Now, I think if you would have looked at the program, you might have said, well, what is this? Hop to it, crafting paper frogs with easy DOE. Right, so a natural question might be, what actually is a paper frog? And so it might be hard to see, but right on the front, we have a couple of paper frogs, but we have a video to show you what it is. And so this is Rory making one of her kind of origami paper frogs, right? And I'll say what we've actually discovered is Rory has been able to make paper frogs with almost any kind of material. So if we have a candy wrapper or some kind of napkin, something like that, it somehow turns into a paper frog, right? And I think how many paper frogs would you say you've made now?
About 100.
I think you've made more than 100. Well, so because Rory was making so many paper frogs, Rory was one of the first users of Easy DOE. So I'll introduce Easy DOE in a minute. But this was kind of her second experiment. So her first one, for those of you who were at the Discovery Summit 2 years ago, we talked about the paper airplane experiment that Rory was one of the first users. And so this really was Rory's second experiment, right? And so this was all from her. It was, Rory, what do you want to experiment on? And she came up with paper frogs. And so, Rory, do you remember what was your purpose?
I wanted to make a frog that could jump far.
Yeah, and so she had actually talked about, what factors can make frogs jump farther, right? And so that's what I actually really liked. I'm like, she's already thinking about kind of factorial experiments, right? Changing more than one thing at a time. And so I said, at the end, are you going to be able to build a jump that jumps really far using jump? Right. So for Easy DOE, so how many of you have heard of Easy DOE in this room? Okay, so I see a few hands go up. So the idea, when we introduced Easy DOE and Jump, it was the idea of trying to combine design and analysis into one platform. So if you think of the way that traditionally we do DOE in Jump, you go through one of the design of experiments platforms, you create a design and make a separate data table, right? Then you're going to go off and collect your data and analyze it. So there's that separation in between the design and analysis, right? Once you have your once you do your make table, you have your data table, you've kind of lost everything that happened before in that design, right? Now the other thing with Easy DOE, we really wanted to help novice users who were uncomfortable with custom design. So we'd heard that a lot. Even maybe you've taken an introductory design of experiments course for a half day, but you load up custom design and you're overwhelmed with all the options. You're like, I don't really know what I want to go about selecting. And so one of the nice things with Easy DOE is that we have hints and additional details throughout, right? So it really is to say, if I get stuck, we're trying to help a user figure out what their next step is going to be. And so I'd say the other part of that is we still want to simplify choices, but we still want to remain true to DOE within Jump, right? And so the idea is that it's a bridge to custom design. And so I'll say maybe in the future what Rory will talk about is how you can transition once you've started an Easy DOE. It is actually much more natural to go into custom design once you're ready or once there's something that Easy DOE can't do. I'll also add, if you're more comfortable with DOE, Easy DOE does have a flexible mode as well that has a few more options that would be available in custom design and the analysis. And one of the nice things with Easy DOE is that at any point you can save where you are and it creates a jump DOE file that you can then share with colleagues. And so where is Easy DOE? If you look under that DOE menu, it's actually just the third option there, right? And so you see, as soon as I launch it, it asks about the different factor types that I might have with details about, might have some examples. It might have some additional details to say this is the type of factor. So Rory, we were talking about trying to create this easy DOE for paper frogs, right? And so I was really appreciative that Rory was already thinking. She'd only done one experiment before, but she said, okay, I know that I want to be testing different factors. So that first tab in Easy DOE is the Define tab. So Rory, what was your response? What were you trying to measure?
My response was how far the frog jumped.
Right, and I think we're going to discuss that a little bit later, right, as to how exactly she measured that response. But so it makes sense, right, I guess, were you 8 or 9 at the time? Maybe 8. I think she was 8 when she did this, so she's 10. She's much bigger now. Right. But so the factors was the big thing. So I mean, how far the frog jumped, that makes sense. That's what we were trying to measure. But so what were the factors that you had decided on?
So the first factor is paper type. Right here would be the cardstock, and here would be the decorative. The size, which is the width of the paper. So 3 inches, 4 inches, or 5 inches. The weight would be if you add a penny on top of it or just leave it normal. The fold would be when you're folding the frog, if you don't put a lot of pressure into your folds, that would be a normal fold. But if you put a lot of pressure and try to line it up really perfectly, then that would be a precise. The force is when you're jumping it, if you put a little amount of force on it, or if you put a bigger amount of force on it. And the surface is where you jump it on.
Right. So those were ultimately the factors that we decided on for her experiment. So just some comments. So I'll say the first time we had done an Easy DOE, she was very unfamiliar with design of experiments and factors. So I'd actually say that the factor specification took a long time the first time, even deciding what's categorical versus continuous. Rory was the one actually driving the Easy DOE the whole time. And I think she was done within a few minutes as to figuring out once she had it in her mind what her factors were, the factor specification was much easier. I'll also say that if you haven't seen Easy DOE of late, we actually have a new factor list look, which makes it much easier to change, right? So in the past, the factor list has, I'll call it the dated version that we have in JMP, right? Where if I wanted to change a factor type, I would have to go in and remove the factor and then add it back in, especially if it was somewhere in the middle. That can be a pain. You'll also see I can add or remove levels here very easily. And same with changing the name. I can reorder the way that things appear in the factor list if I have any reason to. So what would you say? Was that pretty easy to specify those?
Yes.
Yeah. So again, now that we had those, what was our next step in Easy DOE is going to be the model, right? So now we have our factors defined, and I should point that out here too. So if we look at our paper frogs, the idea in Easy DOE is now that I've specified my factors and response, you look at the top here, we have different tabs for what our next step, as well as buttons at the bottom there to move forward. Okay, so in the model, so what had we talked about on our model? So we had discussed interactions, right? And so thankfully, this is one of those things where we talked to her enough about design of experiments that she has some idea that interactions make sense. But what was the problem with the frogs here? So what did a run size of 30 mean?
You have to make and jump 30 frogs.
Right, so even if you saw from that first video, that does take some time to create those 30 frogs. But ultimately, did you decide, was that going to be okay?
Yes.
Yeah, so ultimately, it was 30 frogs that we went with. So now that we have these 30 runs, we have our factors and response defined, So now we can go ahead and actually create the design, right? And do you remember what did this actually represent? Do you remember what that design? So like this first one here, what does that mean? Oops, first row. So I think, so here was like our 30 frogs, right? And so the first would be what? A cardstock, and how big?
A width of 3 inches.
Yeah, and so I believe that the way we had done this, right? Let's see. So the design and data entry. So we had our design. I think that you actually went through and you numbered each of these frogs. Is that right?
Yes.
So I think if you think of that, so here's where we had our design, right? Those paper frogs. Once we had our design, Rory just created them all at one time, right? So she went from 1 to 30. She wrote a number down on it to let us know, and then we randomly put them in a box and randomly pulled them out, right? Because we had the number there. Now, how did you actually go about measuring your response?
So we randomly pulled the frog out of the box. Then we had a starting point for it. We would jump the frog 3 times, and the distance from the starting point to the nose is what we would measure.
Right. And originally, what Rory had picked was the maximum. And I'll say at first you picked absolute. What does the absolute mean?
The absolute value is how far it is from 0.
Right. So she picked the farthest away that it went from 0. But now one of the things so let's just take a quick look at that data entry. Now what you may notice, so here was the distance. So we actually went out with a piece of paper and she put those in. So that minus 28.2, what would that mean if you had a negative 28.2?
It jumped backwards.
Right. So there were a few frogs, and if you see this, that minus 28.2, so I think that was in centimeters, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, you had frogs that were jumping backwards 30 centimeters. All right, so in that case, and this is where I wanted to be as hands-off as I could, knowing that I can always go in after, and help her out. And so, but that was for her, she wanted to pick that maximum, the absolute. So in that case, that minus 28.2, there might have been some that jumped a little bit forward, but she wanted to pick that biggest absolute value. Now, I thought it would be interesting. So I asked Rory, your initial impression. So what did you think right after you had jumped all 30 frogs, before we had done any kind of analysis? So what did you think?
That there was something going on with decorative paper and normal force.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I think, and you also said that paper seems to be important. So I think somewhere I still have that paper where I wrote down exactly what she said. And then what about the other one you had? It looks like you said maybe the no penny is better than a penny. Right, and so we'll see if her intuition was right just after the initial jumping. But I'll say one of the nice things, so in Easy DOE, we just have these main effects plots that show up that you can get a good sense. So it actually looks like maybe she was onto something. It looks like maybe there was, at least in that decorative, and maybe the no penny, maybe those did go a little bit further. Okay, but so now that was great, right? So we had our data. Now what do we need to do? Well, now's the analysis, right? And so again, if you think traditionally from a DOE, we probably could have created a custom design. She has her data table. Now you need to know how to use fit model and go into that. But so what are we able to do? So in Easy DOE, right, we can go right from this into the analysis tab, right? And I think here this was already Rory's best model. But if you see, so in Easy DOE, if you haven't seen this, one of the nice things I like about this platform, especially for users who are kind of new, if you launch even in your custom design, it starts with that full model. Now, I don't know about for yourselves, but typically I always do some kind of model selection, right? If I had those 6 factors and all 2-factor interactions, I probably want to remove some of those terms. And if we want, we can just let Easy DOE pick the best model. I can click on that best model button, right? and then easy DOE is going to choose that way. Now, if you haven't seen this platform, one of the things that you can do in easy DOE, I can very easily add or remove terms just by clicking on confidence intervals within that. And so one of the newer features in easy DOE is it shows me the prospective confidence intervals, and that if I remove a term, it shows me what's going to happen if I were to add that term in next. Right? So in the first version of easy DOE, everything was centered around 0. So now we show what's going to happen, though. Now you have some sense as to where you might want to go next, instead of having to kind of go one at a time. But I'll say, so in the analysis, so we could go about doing that. So let's just go back to that fit model, and we'll just pick the best model. But I did. So also in easy DOE, we have some diagnostic plots. And this is where I was impressed. So we talked about, do you actually even remember, what did you call this one here?
An outlier.
And I was like, yeah. So again, my 8-year-old's calling an outlier. I'm like, okay, I'm doing something right. So that was observation 7. Now, if we went back to that, it was like, uh-oh. So there's one of those minus. So again, if you remember, Rory had picked the biggest value in absolute. So if it jumped back really far, that was the measurement that she had taken. And so I think that there were a few of those kind of outliers, right, where I think even if we remove the first one, let's take a look. So I think in that case, so there was actually a frog for row 7 that jumped forward, right? So you can imagine taking out that 27. So let's start to change that. The best model. And I think we still ended up having, right, another outlier there. And so part of this was, I think, going back and talking to Rory about, well, did we actually want to pick that maximum value? Or maybe we can start talking about something, the biggest positive value, right? Because ideally, you probably want these frogs to go forward in the end. Admittedly, it's impressive if you see a frog jump backwards like 30 centimeters. But I think when we talked about changing the outlier, so again, this is where I wanted, and so if you notice, most of the values were positive now. Once we changed everything to the largest value, so not an absolute, but just how far could it go. There were still some negative values. And so I think if we had the best model here, so I'd say this actually wasn't too bad of a fit, right? That we actually, so things may be an outlier there, but things for the most part have looked pretty good here. Now, what do we do after we have a model, though? If I wanted to ask you, do you remember where would we go next? I guess you probably can't read the Korean. Do you remember what the last tab was? So the predict. Yeah. So this is also one of those things that when you show easy DOE to somebody who hasn't, or who's never seen a profiler before, one of the things I did have to tell Rory was, well, you can actually click in this and see what happens when you start changing what might happen to your frogs. But in this case, if you wanted to pick the best frog, do you remember what the button was called?
Optimize.
Right. And so optimize would tell her, well, if this was the best frog that she wanted, that would be it. But now I'll say, so that was using easy DOE, right? And so Dad said, I'm going to try to impress her, right? I'm a statistician. I'm going to see what was going on here. So I did try a few different things. So again, like here we did have, so each of these frogs, right, because we had jumped it 3 times, right, I had tried like a random effects model for frog to see if I could put that in, because it was like a repeated measurements, right? Each frog was measured 3 times. But what I ultimately decided on was just to take the mean. So I thought it would be simpler because it's easy to explain, you know, what is the average? You just take your average, your mean of those 3 frogs. Another thing we were somewhat concerned about was if there was a time trend. Now, if you recall, though, one of the mistakes, this was on me, one of the mistakes I made was by pulling it out randomly from the box, we didn't actually record the order in which we hopped the frogs. So all we had was the order in which she made the frogs, but not the order in which she hopped them. But however, so one thing I could look at, though, I could look at to see, even within the 3 frogs, we had been a little bit concerned is that was she learning even within a particular frog? You can imagine you might slightly adjust as you're hopping it. But I'll say for that, in analyzing it, and you can even kind of see from the parallel plot here, this is distance 1, 2, and 3. It didn't look like any particular trends that were happening in the distance. Oh, and I should mention, so to get this out of easy DOE, one thing you will actually find is in that data step, I can actually export that data at any point. There's an export button there. We actually have it on multiple of the tabs. That makes it nice if, like in this case, if you have somebody who wants to do some other analysis outside of easy DOE. And so in fact, that was what I had done here. But let's just go back to that table, because one of the nice things that I found with doing that I could prepare some of these for Rory ahead of time, right? And so here was just using Graph Builder for some symbol. And so did it look like here, was there something with cardstock and decorative?
Yes.
Yeah, and so now you can start going through. I could play this if I want. You know, size, and if you want to, this is where you can add line of best fit if you so choose, or just plot the raw data. Maybe something with normal and precise. You know, so maybe it does look like she was onto something with that paper. The weight, again, same thing, maybe, right? It looks like there might be something there. Now, if you recall the other piece that Rory had picked up on, so you were talking about, let's see. Right, so you had said maybe there was something going on with paper, with the paper and the force. And so what do you think from this? Did it look like there was something happening?
Yes.
And you remember, what did you call that?
Interaction.
Right, and again, so this is where you're like, okay, if my 8-year-old is using words like interaction when I show her this, then I feel like I'm doing a good job. But again, so it looks like she was actually even just from hopping it, her natural intuition as to what she thought was important, it looks like that is going to be reflected in the data. Now, if you recall that first analysis, those terms were in there, but we did have a lot of extra terms. However, I'll say that I kind of like this better using that mean, right? Now, I could have went back, right? So I had done a lot of work on myself, right? So I had been playing with this data table. So I could have went back to that original easy DOE and just replaced Rory's response. But again, I kind of like keeping what she had there originally. But so wouldn't it be nice if I could just load this into easy DOE, right? And so this is true if you have your own design that you've created, and especially if you like to do the analysis in easy DOE. And so this is what we've actually found when Rory's tried custom design. Analysis became a much more difficult problem using fit model, but she's much more comfortable using easy DOE. So admittedly, it's a little bit hidden here, but under the factors, there's a load design option. Assuming that I can understand my Korean enough for. So in that load design, if you recall, I had that data table open. So now I'm just going to tell easy DOE, this is the design that I want to load. And so you see, so it actually brought forward that 30 run design that we had. So it didn't matter that it came from easy DOE or not to begin with. It could have been a custom design. It could have been from Excel. And so now the only thing is, now I just need to load a response, right? And so instead of going back in and changing Rory's original, especially you can imagine maybe I made a mistake that maybe I've changed the row, that order got slightly different somewhere along the way. I'd rather be using this one as the truth, that I didn't mess up something along the way. So now I can load in the mean distance here. And I think on this one, when we went to the best model, now if I recall, I think, did you remove this one? Does that sound right?
Yes.
And then maybe size and force. So if you see that one, you may decide that you want to add that in there after the fact, right? So if you look at that confidence interval, even this, Rory had enough to say, you know, maybe I want to try this or not, right? So now this is where we can decide if we want to go further. But I think ultimately, so in your final analysis, what did you find as being important?
So the paper and the weight were important factors. There was an interaction with the paper and the force, and there was also an interaction with the size and the force.
Right. And so now when she wanted to go through and predict, right, so this was where hitting her optimize button, right, this would tell her what the best frog was going to be. And so what was it here?
So the best frog was a decorative paper with a width of 5 inches, no penny, using normal folds, a normal force, and are on a hardwood floor.
Yeah, and I think that the fold and the hardwood and the surface didn't really end up making a difference for her in the end there. One of the other nice things, again, something like Easy DOE, if you want to show something like a profiler, right, so here's where you can now see, if you look at that normal force, one way was to plot it, but now I could have her go through decorative versus cardstock and show her the interaction right from the profiler. All right, and so with that, so just some really quick final thoughts here. I'll say in the end, to keep it simple, so I'll say I had been trying a whole lot of complicated modeling techniques after. I'll say the optimal settings ended up being exactly the same as once we took the mean. Once we had that simpler model in the end, we got the same optimal settings. And so in that sense, to trust the process. So Easy DOE, I mean, the fact that you're designing an experiment and doing it like that, you know, it's going to kind of lead you in the right direction. And just that double randomized, because of me, we lost if there was that time effect. And just what would you do differently? Let's see if we can get that up. Let's see, what would Dad do differently? Well, force was too subjective. I didn't like the light versus normal. I'll also say maybe in the future I have to teach her about split plot designs, because it was a pain running outside and inside for the different surfaces. And how about you? What would you do differently?
I would add another paper type to a factor and maybe change your response to trying to hit a target.
Yeah, because sometimes at lunch we'll actually try to hot paper frogs into like a bowl or a plate. So, but with that, thank you very much for your time. Pleasure.